Welcome to DECODE. Today we begin something special, a new series of videos about the most important scientists and the most important science books ever written, the pillars that build the modern world. And there was, of course, just one place to start, with a quiet, seasick, and shy naturalist who wrote a book that changed our perception about life and the universe. The year is 1859, actually 166 years ago today. The book? On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Of course, it was a revolution, and from that moment on, nothing in biology, in sciences, or in our understanding of ourselves would ever be the same. So on this video, we're going to celebrate Charles Darwin. I'm going to decode his book in layman terms so that everybody can understand exactly how does evolution work, its impact, and the revolution that it unleashed. And of course, please stay all the way to the end because I'm going to give you a surprise. At the end of the video, I'm going to tell you my 6 most important science book ever, in my opinion. So let's begin. The world of biology before Darwin, sure, it was beautiful. It was something, nice to look at, but it was absolutely wrong and very shallow. For centuries, life came with a very simple explanation, which is that the different types of animals and trees, they were fixed. Horses were fixed and, pine trees were fixed. Everything was basically static. Every animal or every plant had been created as it was by a certain god in, whatever time, Nature was perfect, it was stable, and it had been designed, So that takes us to 1850, roughly, give or take, and the study of nature was kind of like a sticker album. You've seen all those kind of like old books, they had like collections of different animals, and they gave them names in Latin, everything very kind of like pretend to be scientific, but there was no mechanisms, no understanding of, okay, how does this work? Why do all birds kind of like look similar? And why do all the fish have things in common, and the plants and all that kind of stuff, So again, there was a certain sense of order because there were catalogs of animals, but really there was no underlying knowledge of how did it work. And of course, by that time, people were beginning to ask questions, like if we see that an animal becomes extinct, how do we explain an extinction? Or how do we explain variation? Again, the different breeds of dogs, for example, or fossils. People were beginning to dig fossils and they were asking, okay, what is all this? And so in the natural sciences, again, there was kind of like this controversy going on. Meanwhile, in the field of geology, they were beginning to find answers, and they were beginning to whisper ideas which were very dangerous to the church, which was that the earth, remember, if you look at the Genesis on the Bible, if you backtrack history, you would find out that the earth would have to be something like 6,000 years old, according to the Genesis. Okay? And people believe that. They believe, oh yeah, the earth is 6,000 years old, and, in the Garden of Eden and all that kind of stuff. And then geologists were beginning to say in the 19th century that, maybe the earth is much older than 6,000 years old. Maybe it's actually millions of years old, if not hundreds of millions of years old. Why did they believe thinking this way? Because they were beginning to realize that the forces that actually affect the planet are very, very slow. Forces like erosion, sedimentation, rivers, fractures. This is all very slow, and actually it acts on time scales of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And so, if those forces were so slow acting on the Earth had to be millions of years old, not thousands. And of course, this basically threw down the toilet all these preconceived ideas of animals being static and all that kind of stuff, because we're like, hey, the Earth is way older, so where do animals come from? And so, in that moment of doubt, in 1850, in England, we meet a young man, 20 years old. His name is Charles Darwin, and he boards a ship called the Beagle. Maybe you heard of it, and here's where our story begins, and this is where things begin getting really, really interesting. So, actually, Darwin was not even supposed to go on the Beagle. Okay, this is a fun story that I'm gonna tell you. His father actually wanted Darwin to become either a doctor or a priest, because that was kind of like his family plan for poor Charles Darwin. And so at age 20, Darwin was looking for a way out to actually avoid this kind of like planned career. And so it turns out that in every ship at that time, the captain would actually have company. And I don't mean in a sexual way, I mean intellectual company, people who were with him just to provide, conversation, someone with culture, etc. And so it turns out that the captain of the Beagle, a gentleman gentleman called Fitzroy was actually seeking for a gentleman to go on the trip with him, not so much as a biologist, but basically as a companion to, have conversations and, have somebody to talk to. And so Darwin joined the Beagle, and he saw this as an opportunity to escape, travel the world, study nature, and again, escape the career path that his family had planned for him. And so again, he boards the Beagle against the will of his father, actually, and he spent 5 years vomiting across the world, because it's funny because Darwin got very seasick on his trips with the Beagle, but again, Darwin was at that time a natural scientist. So what he did is observe, listen, and collect. He filled 22 full notebooks of sketches, fossils, insects, birds, rocks, and bones, and he traveled all over the world with the Beagle, exploring nature. And for example, one of his main stops was on the Galapagos island, where he observed the finches, which is a type of bird. And there he could actually see, and that was one of the things that actually got him thinking, that basically the same bird family, because they were identical from each other, but they had different beaks. The beaks were slightly different, and basically they were adapted to different needs, each one of the beaks or of each one of these finches. He of course also traveled to Patagonia in South Argentina, and there he found giant fossils. And he saw huge extinct mammals lying next to modern creatures. And again, with this, he began getting these ideas of continuity and variation. Continuity as of, okay, this is related to this that lived before, and variation of these guys are basically related to each other. So he began thinking in terms of animals as a family, basically, with ancestors and cousins and nephews and that kind of stuff. He began seeing also geographical patterns. Basically species on neighboring islands on his journeys, they belong to the same family, even if those islands have never been connected one with another. So he found basically similar animals on separate islands. And he began thinking that this had nothing to do with randomness. Life, it looked more, again, as I said, as a family, as a tree with a history, not so much as a series of disconnected species placed on Earth by some sort of like a god, And then Darwin, after these years traveling the world with the Beagle, he returns to England with one question, which is, what if life is not static, but it's actually adapting to the environment? And by doing so, new species of animals can be created. And so Darwin went back home, and he was a well-read man. He was connected to the scientific community. And so he became aware of theories that actually laid the groundwork for his own theory, the theory of natural selection and adaptation. From Malthus, for example, the population scientist, he learned this idea of competition for resources, that basically it's this idea that, populations, they grow and food grows as well. And then the population actually competes for the access to food, defining who survives and who doesn't survive. From Lyell, the geologist, he learned about the old Earth that I was saying before, and he was actually also aware of breeding. Breeding, for example, for dogs, he was aware of this idea of artificial selections, that humans, we are able to reshape a species, like, for example, we've done with dogs. If breeders could create a new dog or a new pigeon variety quickly, nature could actually be doing the same in an automated way, far more slowly, of course, but far more powerful. And this is where his discovery happened, which I'm going to summarize in 5 very easy to follow points. Point number 1, more individuals are born that can survive. Basically, there's a competition for resources in the environment. Second, individuals vary. Some are slightly better suited than others to a given environment. Maybe one will have a little bit of thicker fur, another one will have thinner fur, one will have a little bit shorter legs, one will have a little bit longer legs. And so these variations, coupled with this idea of competition from the environment, are going to help survival or reproduction. Some individuals will have a better chance of survival than others, or a better chance at reproduction. Then, automatically, point number 4, when you reproduce more because you were fitted to the environment, that trait that made you basically successful is going to carry on to the next generation. You get the idea? There's no master plan. Basically, randomly, some creatures are a little bit better suited for the environment. Those statistically, when we talk about millions of individuals, those survive more, and so their traits carry on to the next generation. And then, point number 5, over long periods, the accumulation of these small changes is what we call adaptation to the environment, or what he called natural selection, which is very simple, elegant, and universal. Again, the environment puts us under pressure. We generate individuals with variations. Some variations are a little bit better for that environment than others. Those traits are going to carry on to the next generation because they are more successful. They are very fitted to the environment. And over a long period of time, this is what we called evolution. And Darwin suddenly saw what nobody was seeing, which is life is not static. It's evolving constantly. As we speak, you and me, we are evolving. And if we wait for 1,000,000 years, maybe a human will be different than it is today. And actually, ancient humans were different from what we are today. It's all of it, all the time, everywhere. Life is evolving. As you can imagine, Darwin was terrified by his own theory because it was in direct contradiction of everything that was scientific or religious at that time, in contradiction with the Bible and with common science of the 19th century. And so he was so terrified of the church, of scandal and of ridicule, that he did not publish the book. He waited for 20 years out of fear. And why did he finally decide to publish it? Well, there's a fun story here. One day he received a letter from a young naturalist called Alfred Russel Wallace. And it turns out that Wallace had discovered independently the same mechanism of natural selection. And of course, Darwin panicked because he thought, hey, I discovered this first, and he's going to take the credit when this is something I have been thinking for the last 20 years. And then, of course, he finished his book rushedly, and he published the book November 24, 1859. The first edition of the book sold out instantaneously within a day, and the Victorian world, which is the British Empire of the time, exploded. The church attacked. Are you saying humans are animals? Think about this. At that time, people did not believe humans were animals. Now, if I say that I am an ape, yeah, that's what I am. I'm a primate. I'm a relative of monkeys, apes, and all that kind of stuff, and that's perfectly normal. At that time, it was actually considered heresy. Was he saying that creation was wrong? Because remember that people took the Bible literally at that time. This was all absolutely unacceptable, and because of fear and of retaliation by the church, actually, even within the scientific community, they were split. Some were shocked. Others said, oh, this finally makes sense. And there was a huge debate, and this debate actually happened June 30, 1860, at the British Association for the Advancements of Science in a meeting in Oxford. The two players were actually a guy called Samuel Wilberforce. He was the bishop of Oxford, and he was, razor-tongued, charismatic, very confident debater, and he aimed to defend the church against the heresy that Darwin was proposing, and he wanted to ridicule Darwin. And then defending the Darwin side was actually Thomas Henry Huxley, a biologist, and he was actually well known in the media at that time as Darwin's bulldog. Quiet, calm, logical, but lethal in debate. And this debate actually did happen. And what happened is that, of course, Wilberforce began attacking Darwin, and he gave a long, witty speech against evolution, mocking the idea that humans could be related to animals. And he claimed that Darwin's theory was unproven, dangerous, and even absurd. And then he delivered a joke that became famous at that time to Huxley. He said, "Is it through your grandfather or through your grandmother that you claim descent from a monkey?" That was kind of like the joke. And this was supposed to humiliate Huxley, but Huxley was calm, he was logical, and his response actually went down in the history books of science. He replied very calmly, "If I must choose, I would rather have an ape for grandfather than a man who uses its greatest gifts of intelligence to obscure the truth." So as a result, of course, slowly the theory of Darwin of evolution and natural selection began being more accepted through the years and decades, but still he got hate mail for decades. Victorians, they sent him letters accusing him of destroying morality, the family, and even the texture of civilization. But still, he lived long enough to see his theory explode and become mainstream. Darwin died of old age, 1882, and the nation faced a really unexpected question, which is, where do you bury this man who actually rewrote the rules of life and our relationship with religion? And the answer was actually historic. If you ever visit London, I invite you to go there because it's a very, very interesting place. If you go to Westminster Abbey, there's a visit that you can do that you can see the tombs of the greatest of Britain, and among them is Charles Darwin, who was actually buried very close to Sir Isaac Newton, the famous physicist. We may do another video about him one day. So again, you have a naturalist, a biologist, lying beside the greatest physicist of all time, Isaac Newton. And so that was kind of like a sign from the church of admitting that this man that he was once feared now deserved all sorts of honors. So now I'm going to focus on the impact of the origin of species in the natural sciences. First, it unified biology. Before Darwin, there was chaos, nothing was understood. Darwin gave a very coherent system that explains how everything works in terms of variations, in terms of, ancestors, in terms of evolutions, extinctions, etc. It explains, for example, biodiversity. It explains why do we have millions of species in the world, because that's a matter of branching descent. We basically create branches of animals, and those generate new animals as, millennia and millions of years pass. It explains similarity. For example, now we understand that a hippo is actually similar to a whale in some areas because both are mammals and they're different from a fish. And that's all very easy to understand once you understand the basic building blocks of evolution. It predicted one thing that was found actually later, which is what's called transitional fossils, which is basically this idea that if we need to move from creature A to creature B across millions of years, there needs to be creatures in between. For example, the Archaeopteryx. The Archaeopteryx, which is this dinosaur, which is kind of like a hybrid of a classic reptile-looking dinosaur and a modern bird, that's explained by evolution. And evolution, of course, was stated before actually finding this fossil. And of course, the most important part is that it connected us humans in the whole tree of life. Before this, of course, there was this perception that humans were like, the chosen species created by God from clay or whatever it was. And now we understand that we're not separate, we're not special, we're just a branch from the tree, that we come from an ancestors of the primate, the ape type, and that slowly we have generated different types of hominids, and from there we move to Homo sapiens, which is basically us. That all makes sense, and so because of that, we of course can say that there's biology before Darwin and definitely after Darwin. He is a before and an after. But not only that, even if we look at today, in the 21st century, there's lots of disciplines within science that owe mostly everything to Darwin, basically. Without Darwin, there will be no genetics. Mendel, the guy with the chickpeas and the different combinations of genes. Mendel explained how traits mutate and they're inherited. Darwin predicted this idea that we generate variations of our genes, so to say. He didn't use that word because it was not discovered yet, but basically that Mendel then later explained how that happens. So for example, in the case of humans, if I generate sperm cells, for example, my sperm cells are actually copies, and whenever my sperm is actually a copy of another cell, because of the copy being imperfect, that generates small variations on my DNA on each one of those sperm cells. And then what happens is that the same thing happens with a female. And then when these two cells actually join, what happens is that we're creating a new specimen, which is actually not a combination of A and B, but also has some variations which come from these copying errors. We understand that now, and that's all due to Darwin. Of course, we have also understood the rules of ecology, predators, prey, niches, ecosystems, all that kind of stuff makes a lot of sense thanks to Darwin. Now we understand that every species is locked in a constant negotiation with its environment and other creatures living on that environment, shaping entire ecosystems through competition, cooperation, and specialization. Basically, that is the basis of, differential equations, Volterra-Lotka systems, and that's the root of game theory, for example, when it comes to animal behavior. Darwin also explains a lot of things about medicine, antibiotic resistance, for example. Antibiotic resistance is easily explained because bacteria are actually adapting to the antibiotics, and they're becoming resistant, you see? And so we need new drugs to actually combat these adapted bacteria, And same thing with psychology, for example. Psychology owes a lot to evolutionary science. Why do we say, oh, this country is going to succeed and this country is going to fail? Well, because they're applying the same rules of natural selection and evolution. Some countries are actually better suited for competition, some are less well suited, and those less well suited will disappear and the other ones will thrive, for example. You see? So again, evolution is actually everywhere, from, technology with genetic algorithms and AI, for example, or philosophy. It's everywhere, So now I'm going to devote a short section because, again, this is my goal by the end of this video is that you can talk to anyone about evolution and understand perfectly well what it says and what it does not say. There's a few common misunderstandings about Darwin, and I'm going to clear them right away in a very, very easy way. Okay, so the first one is that idea of, it's the survival of the strongest. Nope, it's not the survival of the strongest, it's the survival of the fittest. And this distinction is very, very important. Fittest meaning the best adapted to the environment. Some environments could actually favor strength, and that will be the survival of the strongest. But some others may favor those that are more resistant to cold temperatures, some to basically smartest or more agile, or maybe the smallest because they need to hide. So again, it's not strongest, it's survival of the fittest, the ones that are more adapted. Second misunderstanding. Please stop seeing evolution as progress. It's not progress, it's adaptation. We humans need to think in terms of progress because we establish victory conditions, and this is good and this is bad. In nature, there is not good or bad. It's adapted or not adapted. And of course, sure, we can say the ones who don't adapt, they perish, and that's when we can assign this quality of worse or better. But again, it's not progress because nature is blind. Nature is not trying to achieve anything. It's just producing random variations, some more better, some more worse, in terms of their adaptability to the environment. But that doesn't make them good or bad, it's just variations. Third, there is no goal, there is no plan. Again, in the pre-Darwin world, where there was kind of like a creator and a god and all that kind of stuff, basically we thought, we're trying to achieve something. Okay, evolution is an open-ended process. It's happening as we speak. There is no destination. It reacts to conditions, conditions in the environment and variability in our DNA, but it does not have a plan. It's not trying to achieve anything. The only thing that happens is that every individual animal will try to survive according to his fitness to the environment. Fourth, evolution is not random. Mutations are random, but selection is not random at all. What I'm trying to say is that, sure, from an ancestor, there's going to be, successors of that ancestors, and those are going to have a random variation of their DNA. And that is random, but the process is not random because basically the selection is absolutely deterministic. For example, if you're trying to survive in Antarctica, the selection is going to be very cruel. It's going to be basically which one of these guys is actually better at sustaining cold temperature and, for example, finding very, very little food, for example, right? So again, evolution is not a random process. Mutations are random, but evolution is actually absolutely deterministic. 5. Darwin does not take sides when it comes to religion or faith. At that time, of course, the church saw Darwin as a threat to its power. But if you think about it, Darwin does not say if this is caused by a god or not. What he's trying to explain is a mechanism without actually discussing who is behind that mechanism. If you choose to be an atheist, of course for you, God is not needed and evolution is everything. But if you choose to be a believer, and that's perfectly fine, you'll think, hey, this is a very beautiful mechanism, but it was actually created by some sort of god. So Darwin does not take sides. Actually, he was a believer most of his life. 6. Of course, humans are not at the top. Sometimes because we have this ego and this anthropocentrism, we say, oh, humans are at the top of the evolution scale. No. Sharks are also at the top, and elephants and anything that's alive today, it's actually at the peak of its evolution. But if you think about it, in 10,000 or 100,000 years, these creatures will be substituted by better ones, more fitted to the environment, same thing as us. So again, we are not kind of like the peak of the tree. No, we're just a branch from the tree. And that's what we are. We're one more of the millions of species just trying to find its better fit to the ecosystem, to the environment. And last but not least, and this is, I think, the biggest contribution of Darwin, is that basically evolution is an emergent process. There is no design. And that's a huge mental paradigm shift that Darwin created. The idea is that what he said is that simple processes that repeated over millions of years, they can generate an astonishing amount of complexity without any plan or without any design. And so what Darwin did, before fractals and before differential equations and before many of these things, he explained one of the first great complex systems ever described in science in absolute detail. Because if you think about it, evolution and the rules of natural selection, it is a complex system. We humans, we seek patterns and we seek designs because we try to find explanations that are actually comfortable to us. But the explanation doesn't need to be comfortable, it needs to be true. Nature does not need to follow our internal brain logic. Nature is not seeking anything other than imposing some rules for the survival of the fittest. And of course, now in the 21st century, the shadow of Darwin still looms large over large swaths of science. For example, in genomics, now we can compare entire genomes letter by letter, and we know the complete genomes of different animals, and we're actually even discussing the possibility of bringing extinct animals back by reconstructing their DNA. We have very advanced techniques such as CRISPR. CRISPR is actually a technique that, in very simple terms, it allows us to copy and paste and cut and paste and rewrite DNA. And by using CRISPR in the future, we're going to be able to actually cure many diseases because we can predict which specific change are going to be causing the problem. And maybe in the future, we can actually cut and paste and fix those even before we are born. Another field that actually inherits from Darwin is what we call LUCA. LUCA are the acronym of Last Universal Common Ancestor. This is a field of active research which is trying to find the origins of life. So if we are all basically related to one another, and this is kind of like a tree, okay, the question is, what is the root? There has to be some sort of, primordial life, some sort of very, very simple microorganism or bacteria or something like this. That's actually the originator of life on Earth. And that's a very active field of research. There's different theories. There's the what's called the abiogenic theory, which actually says that life actually spawned on Earth from inert matter. And, there's the Miller-Urey experiment trying to prove that back in the day. There's the panspermia theory, which says that life came to Earth from a comet, some sort of like a meteor or a comet actually brought life into Earth. But then, of course, that reopens the question of, okay, but then where did it come from? So again, this LUCA theory is actually, a follower of Darwin, of saying, okay, so yeah, if we're all related and we are all variants and we are all, we have ancestors, okay, what is the last universal common ancestor? So today we celebrate Charles Darwin and the origin of species. 166 years ago today, Charles Darwin published a book that revealed the unity of all life on Earth, that every creature from bacteria to blue whales, from insects to humans, is part of one long story, the story of evolution. And today we stand at the edge of the next big revelation, which is that life may not even be unique to Earth, and we have powerful telescopes like the James Webb telescope reading the atmosphere of distant worlds. And as I've said in other videos, we now have indirect proof that we're seeing planets that, of course, we will never be able to see, eye to eye because they're, light years away. But they have the same biosignature of the primitive Earth and with the same gases and the same constituents that make us think that most likely life is not too unique to our planet, but it actually appears everywhere. We can detect things like water vapor and methane and CO2 and even complex molecules like DMS, dimethyl sulfide, which are the potential fingerprints of that same mechanism of life and evolution in very distant worlds. So again, for the first time in history, Darwin said, we are all related and humans are not special. And now we are about to say, and you know what? Earth is not special either. Are we alone? Most likely no, and we're on the verge of finding out. Darwin wrote the first chapter of this super exciting journey, and the next chapter may start actually in another world far away from Earth. So now, as I promised, I'm going to tell you, in my opinion, which are the 6 most important science books ever written. I'm going to say them in chronological order, starting with, of course, On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres by Nicholas Copernicus, published in 1543. It was Copernicus who actually discovered that Earth is not the center of the universe, contradicting the previous knowledge by, Ptolemy and, all the ancient astronomers. And basically, he gave mathematical proof that there was a much simpler explanation if you put the sun at the center of the universe at that time, And not only that, but basically this book actually presents the beginning of what we call the scientific revolution. So book number 1, of course, Copernicus. Book number 2 is kind of like a close relative of Copernicus, which is, of course, the dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems by Galileo Galilei. Galileo actually learned from Copernicus' theory, and if Copernicus was the originator of the theory, Galileo was actually the promoter of the theory, the one who actually made it widespread. And the way he did this is by writing a book, which is a dialogue between 2 scientists, 2 fake scientists. One of them follows the Copernican revolution viewpoint of, sun being at the center of the universe, and the other one actually following the Ptolemaic theory, which was Earth at the center of the universe. And the interesting part about Galileo is that he created most of what we would call the scientific method, because he provided proof. His proof, Galileo is one of the inventors of the telescope, the refractor telescope, that he used to do very early observations. And so he could prove that Copernicus was right by observing the moons of Jupiter, the way they moved. And so he thought, if these moons move around this thing that's actually a planet, most likely our moon does the same. And so we are also orbiting something else, which would be the sun. He also observed the phases of the planet Venus, which you can observe with an amateur telescope from Earth any day today. He's observed sunspots on the sun. And so with all this, he built a corpus of proof of saying, hey, Copernicus was right, and here's the proof why. Okay, so again, book number 2, the dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems by Galileo Galilei, that got him in prison for all his life. And by the way, there's a fun story. I don't know if you know this, but actually the Catholic Church actually did a pardon to Galileo Galilei in the times of Pope John Paul II, which was in 1992. Okay? That was fast. Anyway, book number 3 is going to be, of course, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy by Isaac Newton. Okay, Newton, basically, this book is a tome, and it covers everything from gravity to the rules of motion to the rules of, the 3 laws of Newton, the basis of calculus, the discipline of calculus, and basically what Newton did is he gave a method for physics and for mathematics that was universal, and it could be applied to any phenomena, such as, the orbits of the planets, or, motion in on Earth, and, anything in between, So again, Isaac Newton, considered the biggest physicist of all time. His book stands at number 3. At number 4 is going to be Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, 1859. We've spoken about him today, so no need to go in more detail. Book number 5, in my opinion, 1916. And you dare which one is it? Of course it is. The Theory of Relativity, the Special and the General Theory by Albert Einstein. Basically from 1687, which is Newton, to 1916, we were working with Newtonian mechanics, and then comes Einstein and actually proved that Newtonian mechanics, sure, they can work in a simplified universe, but once you need to understand, kind of like bigger things and bigger cosmology, things are beginning to, diverge from Newtonian mechanics, and you need something, like bigger firepower, and that's relativity. The special theory of relativity deals with basically the speed of light and the relative velocities of things as they approach the speed of light, and then the general general theory of relativity. It's about cosmology and about the structure of space-time, And so I said it's 6 books, and this is book number 5. And book number 6 is actually the least famous of all of them, I guess. But it's actually a very, very good book. It's a thick read, so only get on this one if you have, patience. But it's actually a book from 1962 by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Up to Thomas Kuhn, basically, we believe progress, scientific progress and technological progress was kind of like a constant slope line, so to say, and, it was kind of like, gradual. Then Thomas Kuhn actually, he coins this term called the paradigm shift, which actually explains all the revolutions of science and technology and things like the internet and cell phones and AI and, of course, relativity and, Darwin and all that kind of stuff, which is basically that he states that revolutions actually do happen when the time is ripe for that revolution to happen, and they happen in a very sudden way. It's not like this is a gradual process. It's more like breaking points in which we decide to push knowledge forward by stating a new theory, be it relativity, the origin of species or anything like that, So this is, in my opinion, the 6 most important books ever by scientists, and I hope I'm going to do further videos on this series about famous scientists and their books, maybe talking about some of this. So this was my episode today here at Decode. Again, this is my first chapter on a series that I'm going to devote to scientists and their magna opus, their main books. This is a new type of content for me, so if you like it, please press like, and if you don't, please put it on the comments, because again, I would like to know if you guys are interested in this kind of material. I'm a science guy by training. I've been doing science all my life, and so these subjects for me are deeply interesting, but maybe they're not for you guys, or maybe they are for you, and maybe you really enjoy them. And if that's the case, hey, put here down in the comments below which scientist would you like me to cover next. I could do Einstein, or I could do any of the the big ones, but maybe you want to talk about Tesla, or maybe you want to talk about Marconi, who's actually not so well known, but it's actually very, very, very important. So again, use the comments below to give me inspiration and give me feedback of if we're doing a good job and what we can cover next. And again, remember, Decode keeps growing. I'm very, very happy. So if you subscribe to Decode, you know that YouTube gives more visibility to the videos. So please hit subscribe. We put videos every Tuesday and every Friday. And actually, on the next video, which is going to drop next Friday, we're going to begin our Christmas special, which is going to be a special, series of videos as well as we do the run up to Christmas. So please subscribe so that you don't miss those videos either. Okay, so thanks for watching Decode, and see you on our next episode. Thank you.